is Jane Low on site at Marina Bay Sands at the Singapore International Cyber Week 2022. And I'm very pleased and very privileged to have Rowland Johnson, who is the president of CREST International, to share with us the latest initiatives that's launched by CREST recently, as well as anything that ranges from penetration testing to vulnerability assessment and so on. So thank you, Rowland, for joining us today.
Thank you ever so much. Delighted to be here with you.
Yeah, thank you. You made a long trip from UK to Singapore, overnight trip, jet lag and everything.
Yeah, I am, yeah. So hopefully what I say will make sense, and you'll have to give me a prod if I start.
All right, I will. Right, so Rowland, for our audience who's not too familiar with CREST, right, I think some of us would associate CREST with penetration testing, but it's a lot more than that. So tell us about CREST and, the history of it.
Yeah, so I guess CREST has been going since around about 2006. We were formed in the UK, predominantly with a focus initially on the pen testing space, but as time has gone by, that's grown into incident response, into threat intelligence, into red teaming, into security operations centres. In addition to that, our organisation has grown and expanded. We've launched chapters in Singapore, in wider parts of Asia. We have councils in Australia, in the EU, and in America. I guess the focus has broadened from something just looking at penetration testing exams. We're really focused on building capability, capacity, consistency, and community. And what does that mean? So we want to build capability. That's not just at the top. We want to provide pathways for people coming out of schools and colleges and universities that want to get into the industry. We don't think there should be just one measurement point. There should be lots of measurement points so that people can demonstrate their skills and competencies back to the people that employ them and also to the buying community.
Okay.
We want to build capacity, so there's recognition that there's just not enough skilled people within the industry, and so CREST is very focused on trying to drive that capacity. We don't think there should just be one answer to this, in one region in the world or in one industry vertical. We need to come up with a solution that spans the whole of the world. So we want to have consistent approaches, whether or not you're in Singapore or in Thailand or in Vietnam or in Australia. There should be some consistency. All of the skills and talent shouldn't be focused on financial services. We need to be able to deliver across all of the industry. And I guess the last thing that we're focused on is we can't do this on our own. We have to collaborate with other organisations. So we're very engaged with the buying community, with obviously the service providers that we work with to accredit and certify, but also government, regulators and other NGOs as well. Exciting times.
Yes, very exciting. You have recently launched two initiatives, the Open Web Application Security Project Initiative as well, and the Defensible Penetration Testing Initiative as well. And you made some changes in terms of certification to your penetration testing sort of certification as well. But before we go into that, if I may just ask two questions relating to penetration testing, because I think those are the two questions that many people have in mind when it comes to penetration testing. So what is penetration testing? Because a lot of people think, is it red teaming? Is it vulnerability assessment? Does it include social engineering? Is it phishing?
So you pose a really interesting question. And the challenge with this is that there's not clear language used to describe penetration testing that's pervasive across the whole of the world. And what I mean by that is, in some regions people will talk about pen testing, in other regions people will talk about technical assurance, other people will call it VAPT, people will talk about red teaming and threat modelling and threat assessments. And if you're a buyer, they all sound quite similar. If you're in the industry and potentially delivering those types of services, you might understand the nuances and the differences. But what we need to try and do as an industry is collectively remove some of the asymmetry that exists between buyers and suppliers, use less confusing language. From CREST perspective, I guess pen testing could include things like web application security testing. It could include social engineering. It could include things that are focused on traditional technology, OT technology, cloud technology. I don't think that I would choose to specifically contain it specifically. Rather, I would say that we typically recommend that when an organisation is looking at security assessments or penetration testing, they undertake some form of scoping initially. And really, the purpose of that is to understand what is the motivation, what is the goal, what is the objective the assessment is supposed to be delivering against. If you understand that, then potentially it will mean actually all you need to do is some form of vulnerability assessment. But if you're looking for something that has more rigor and you're looking to have a degree of exploitation, understand potentially the impact, that might move you towards something that's more focused towards penetration testing. If you say actually we're not looking at understanding all of the vulnerabilities or issues that exist across our estate, specifically you want to understand, could attacker compromise that one specific data set or that one specific system? In that instance, it might require an organisation to conduct a red teaming exercise. So ultimately, to answer your question, it's all driven by the scope. The scope will determine whether or not it's vulnerability assessment, whether it's pen testing, whether or not it's web app centric, whether it's social engineering or red teaming. And the key to having successful outcomes is to make sure that that scoping exercise is done by somebody that is technically competent.
Given the threat environment that and landscape that we have been seeing, where we talk about the Russian-Ukraine cyber threat attacks, we talk about a lot of ransomware, right? A lot of these things, supply chain attacks, for example, a lot of these happen in the last two years, right? So what kind of impacts had that had in organizations looking at the scoping of a penetration testing exercise or vulnerability assessment or some form of security assessment? Has there been a shift from, say, penetration testing towards, say, a more focus on looking at incident response capabilities? It's kind of like an assume breach kind of mindset.
Yeah, so I think all of the above. I would say that the pen testing sector is having to evolve. I think that there is closer synergy potentially between people that are doing offensive security and those that are working in SOCs or in blue teams. Right. I think historically it was a little bit like oil and water and they didn't mix. There's now understanding actually if you're going to make your SOC effective and make sure that your MDR capability is robust, then you need to be targeting it using exploitation techniques that are being seen in the wild. No better way to do that than use a pen testing team or a red teaming team to work together. And so we're definitely seeing pen testing, incident responders, SOCs, threat intelligence analysts all coming together to try and add something collectively to understand whether or not an organisation is vulnerable and whether or not data can be compromised.
So you talked very briefly about different chapters around the world, also different councils. So the Singapore one was set up back in 2016. 2016,
that's correct.
Right, at the first Singapore International Cyber Week, right?
Yes, indeed, I remember it.
Yeah, so tell us about some of the programs in the Singapore chapter over the last 5-6 years.
Yeah, so in many respects, the Singaporean chapter is an exemplar of success. It went from, in 2016, there were no organisations that were really identifying as being penetration testing providers within the region, to in 2022, around about 60 members.
Oh wow, fantastic.
Now, that's good, but it also presents some challenges. And so what I would describe often is industry and events like this will get keynote speakers that are very experienced, very capable, and very sophisticated, and they will talk about what is best. Okay, so you need to go off and have threat-led assessments, you need to go off and be able to do comprehensive threat modelling, you need that to shape your red teaming exercise, etc., with a focus on being on the top of the market. And I'm not suggesting that that's not important, but you can't get to the top of the market without, first of all, being in the middle of the market or the bottom of the market as well. Now, all of this is an ongoing and continual process. There are organisations in Asia operating at all aspects of the market, so at the top, in the middle, and at the bottom.
Like different maturity tiers?
Different maturity, absolutely, that's right. Okay. With different alignment to different industry verticals. So some organisations are very focused on government initiatives, others focused on application-centric security, others focused on banking and finance, others obviously focusing on OT. But it was challenging initially to work out, well, who are the stakeholders that are delivering services in this space? So when we launched our chapter in 2016, as I say, we had no members in the region. Fast forward 7 years later, now 60 plus members. So there's quite a defined user community that is active and vibrant, delivering services within the space. The challenge that we have today is that we need to help present them more effectively to the buying communities to ultimately say, these are the ones with speciality in OT, these are the ones that specialise in cloud, these are the ones that focus on parts of CNI.
Okay.
And so there are a lot of initiatives taking place within CREST at the moment to do, to have better engagement with the buying community, to make sure that the service providers that operate in the market are delivering services that are in tune with the needs of those buyers.
So tell us about your initiatives, the recent ones that you have launched.
OVS and the defensible pen test
That's
standards.
right.
Yeah, so I guess if we pause and sort of review the landscape as it is, 2022 organisations still being compromised. I was looking back in my notes a couple of days ago when the TK Maxx breach happened in the US 15 years ago. Okay, so organisations are being compromised just as frequently, potentially more frequently than 2022 than at any other time before. Yet pen testing, incident response, cybersecurity in theory should all have improved. Why is it that we're not seeing a reduction in the number of compromises and data breaches? And one of the challenges has been that the rate of change has been just absolutely massive.
Digital transformation,
Digital
right?
transformation and also migration to the cloud, working practices, etc., have evolved significantly.
Yeah, IoT.
Absolutely.
Right.
And one of the challenges is that standards haven't really kept up.
Okay.
And so there have been, a series of standards and initiatives that have been launched by organisations like OWASP over the years. OWASP Top 10 initially as a point of measuring web application environments and systems, and ASVS and MASVS. But although those standards existed, nobody has really necessarily on scale gone off and operationalised them. One of the challenges we see is that if you are vendor X, you might go off and deliver very robust penetration testing services, but there wasn't necessarily a framework that said you needed to do it with a consistent methodology that was exactly the same across all entities, or the reports were consistent across all different entities.
Right.
And so as a consequence, it has made it quite challenging for buyers when they wanted to compare test reports between vendors, between years. Often,
so it's difficult to say what is good.
Absolutely,
Am
that's
I
right.
performing better
That's
than
right.
last year?
But if you had two different pen tests conducted by two different providers across 2 different years, the way that they present them, the language that they use, the graphs, the data collection points, etc., are often quite inconsistent. And so the feedback that we have had from the supply chain and from governments and regulators is we need to become a little bit more consistent. As we did continue to digitise, as there are more and more applications that are rolled out, we can't have piecemeal approaches to assessment. If you're going to go off and assess an app store, for example, and potentially look at 1 million different apps, you can't have 500,000 different ways of reviewing them. There's got to be one consistent way of doing it. There needs to be some form of standardisation. Yeah. Standardisation doesn't have to mean commoditisation, because often people will go, well, hang on, standards, don't like the sound of that, sounds like a race to the bottom. No. The intention with things like OVS, which, as I say, leverages ASVS and MASVS, is to provide a risk-based framework where organisations can say, my application is super sensitive, being used in parts of critical national infrastructure, therefore I need to have a high level of assurance. Or alternatively, it is a bit more brochureware or less impactful in terms of PII or geolocation information, therefore I'll do a less onerous assessment. But there needs to be some way to measure consistently. Okay, there needs to be some way to report consistently. So if you're going to be, an app store provider and be able to baseline against 1 million different apps, there needs to be some kind of rigor and standards built into it.
Well, coming from the banking background, just thinking, it's sort of like having a set of international, the analogy is international accounting standards. So some form of way of reporting your revenues, your sales, your costs.
And so what we're seeing is that there are a number of initiatives taking place around the world where governments and regulators are looking at the challenge, back to my scenario of organisations still being breached, and they're going, okay, well, we need to intervene. Although the cybersecurity market is more mature today than it was maybe 10 years ago, it's still not functioning as effectively as we would like. So there's lots of talk about introducing regulation, some form of legislation or frameworks to measure what good looks like. And so although that isn't necessarily a bad idea, it presents quite a lot of challenges internationally. So if you have legislation that's defined, for example, in Singapore, that says the standard is here, bar X, and then you have a different standard that is introduced by a legislative function in the UK, and then a different one in the European Union, and you're a service provider that straddles all of those, which standard do you work to? So there needs to be some form of harmonisation.
That's a good point.
Okay?
That's right.
Without it, you end up with a patchwork quilt of standards that are all well intended, but actually make it really very difficult for a service provider to deliver into. What's more than that, in addition to that, supply chains are really complex. So you might have an organisation that's in the UK that says, I want to commission a security assurance activity or a pen test. I want you to look at this cloud environment. That cloud environment might be in the west coast of America, but it might be capturing data that's from Asia that potentially is being maintained by a service provider that's in Australia. Which legislation and regulation do you need to try and adhere to when you're in an environment that is so diverse? And so I guess one of the things that CREST is doing with OVS is trying to define standards, try and define standards that are, palatable and will be functional across the world, that aren't only focused at the top, that provide a pathway to measure low risk to medium risk to high risk, and at the same time allow organisations with a myriad of different skills and competencies to be able to participate. Historically, CREST has had examinations that we have very successfully deployed around the world. But we need to be more inclusive than that. We need to look at other career pathways, other exams and other qualifications. Okay. And that doesn't necessarily mean equivalencies, but if you have gone off and taken an exam pathway from vendor X, and we say, the only way that we can attest to skills and competencies if you've taken an examination from CREST, actually what we're doing is fueling the problem. We're not helping with the skills gap. So I think as part of the standards that we're working on, we're looking at lots of different ways to demonstrate skills and competencies, looking at frameworks and certifications from the likes of SANS and EC Council and CompTIA and Offensive Security, and going, okay, if you're offering services at the lower level, what skills and competencies are appropriate? If you're specifically doing work within financial services or within healthcare, again, what skills and competencies, what exams, qualifications, how many years of experience might be required. And we're trying to do that from a very inclusive perspective, where if you've gone off and done training or development through other career pathways, that's fine. We don't expect you to have to retrain using CREST certifications.
You're sort of reforming your accreditation criteria as well, aren't you?
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do is be cognizant of the challenge that lies in front of us. I think one of the things that we observe is that there are many organisations that do things that are a little bit similar, but not necessarily similar enough. We need to be able to do more collaboration. So as a result, one of the things that, the reasons why we decided to work with OWASP is they've gone off and created a really, really good standard for web application security assessment. We could have gone off and created our own standard, but I don't think that actually helps with the challenge. It makes much more sense. Yeah. That's right. Let's go off and leverage the things that already exist. If there are other frameworks that exist for OT or cloud, instead of CREST going off and creating their own alternative, let's work with the likes of Cloud Security Alliance. Let's work with other organisations that are delivering standards and leverage them so that the whole of the industry can benefit.
And defensible penetration testing, what is that about?
Again, great question. And I guess it is generated because many organisations around the world are doing security assessments. Whether or not they're pen tests or vulnerability assessments, we can argue about what it is that they're doing. But what they're trying to do is do some form of security assurance activity to give them confidence that they can't be hacked. Unfortunately, in many instances, organisations experience ransomware or have their environment compromised. And the shareholders will then go to the senior leadership team and the management and go, how did this happen?
Yeah.
We've invested money.
Yeah.
How did data get compromised? And often when you dig into the detail, it's because it wasn't appropriately scoped. The scope was defined, but then the execution phase didn't align with it. Or alternatively, there wasn't a sign-off process. Potentially the skills and competencies at each of those different 3 levels wasn't appropriate. And so really what we said with the defensible pen test standard is, what is it that a cybersecurity organisation, what should they do to deliver a commercially reasonable assurance activity? Whether or not that be vulnerability assessment or pen testing, what is the baseline or the minimum set of expectations that they should be working against? We think that they should be having skilled and competent people being used at the scoping, delivery and sign-off phase. We think that there is a degree of reproducibility that would be expected throughout an assignment. We would expect there to be a number of different technical parameters that are operated across all of those different phases. In addition to that, we think that the individuals should be accountable, and so if they deliver a scoping engagement, they should be held to account that the scoping was accurate and fit for purpose for what the buyer was asking for.
It's a big responsibility.
Well, it's moving the goalposts away from where it was historically. You've got this disconnect where you've got a buyer saying, I want to be secure. You've got a service provider that will go, well, hang on a second, I'm never ever going to test that you're going to be secure.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay? And so you've got to try and find some kind of middle ground where you go, okay, it's better than what we've got today. So there needs to be a level of accountability. I think the industry needs to evolve. We need to be professionalising. There needs to be a code of conduct that people sign up to say, I know what is expected of me. I know what the expectations are of somebody that's going off and assessing an infrastructure. I understand, what the completeness of the requirement is. I understand the depth and the breadth that's required. And if they can't cover all of the elements, they need to be able to present it in a format, report it back to the end user in a fashion that they understand. So instead of the end user thinking they've got a sign-off process that is complete and the whole of their estate has been assessed, they understand what's been assessed and what elements were potentially omitted because of potentially time issues, etc. So it's the defensible standards is really designed to give greater assurance to a buyer that when they've gone off and procured an assessment, that they've done so in an appropriate fashion, using skilled and competent people that understand what is expected of them. We don't think that this is the final finished product. We think that there will be multiple iterations that are launched as the industry continues to mature and progress in future years, but it's a step further than what we've ever had before. There has been no standard historically that's ever existed in the pen testing space.
Oh, right,
so it is a first.
Right. It goes back to the point, your point earlier about having standards, harmonized standards for reporting, because you can't exactly compare one report from one vendor to another. There's no consistent benchmark.
I think that's right. Yeah. So again, it's not about trying to commoditize. It's trying to harmonize. We recognize that organizations will want to have their own unique approaches to conducting assessments, and that's great, but there needs to be some commonality.
Some baseline, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
I think that's it.
Okay.
And I guess we believe that actually in time, automation will become increasingly relevant. I don't imagine that people will be replaced by tooling for many, many years to come, but I do think that there are elements of an assessment that can be automated, maybe the first 30, 40, 50%, really with the value add being delivered by people thereafter, where they're looking at role-based access controls and trying to understand the differences in terms of function and requirement from one user community to another user community. At the moment, you can't automate that or proceduralize that. It definitely requires a consultant with skills and competency to conduct that type of assessment.
It sounds like a lot of work ahead of you for the next...
I think at the moment, really what we're trying to do is is collaborate. I don't think CREST thinks that they have a monopoly on all of the
course,
good ideas.
You're looking for partnerships.
We want to partner with people. We understand the challenge. We understand some of the needs between those different stakeholders that we engage with, and we're trying to really facilitate conversation that is both cross-industry and cross-border. The one thing that we know, won't help the industry is if we come up with lots of different industry answers or regional answers. Otherwise, that just leads to a patchwork quilt of different standards and regulation. There needs to be some way of harmonising it.
Well, thank you, Rowland, for sharing with us, what is has been the landscape of penetration testing over the last, 10 years or something, and what it is, what it looks like today. And one final question, if I may.
Yep.
So for the buyers out there, when they are looking for a penetration testing provider, what would be the sort of important questions that they should be asking?
Yeah, so I think that clearly we're slightly biased. We think accreditation has some value. The reason why accreditation is valuable, it sets a minimum set of standards. And so I guess ultimately, to answer your question, buyers should be looking for a way to get comfortable that an organisation can operate against a baseline of standards, whether that's baseline accreditation standards, whether that's standards against things like OVS or defensible pen testing standards, or something else. There needs to be some form of way of benchmarking vendor X versus vendor Y. One of the things that we know doesn't work is that when you go out and just say, send me a sample report. Okay, as much as that sounds like a great idea,
well, for me it does.
One of the challenges there is that vendor X will go, here's a report that's got lots of vulnerabilities on it, lots of critical vulnerabilities, lots of high vulnerabilities, etc. And what is actually an indication of? Is that an indication of an environment that had lots of vulnerabilities?
That's right.
Or is it a indicator of a very skilled and competent organisation? It could be either. And so we would argue that in its purest sense, won't necessarily provide the level of assurance that a buyer would hope. Similarly, I think our suggestion is buyers need to have a clear understanding of what the goals and the objectives are for the assessment. The threat landscape's evolving massively. Okay, if you want to go off and do a compliance-led assessment, that may well be point in time. If you want to have a strong understanding of what your risk posture is, that's probably not going to be delivered by something that's just point in time. You need to be thinking about ways to continually assess and continually stay in tune with the evolving threat landscape. So I guess ultimately it's having a clear understanding of what the goals and objectives are initially, for the buying community, making sure that they have a baseline of standards that are able to compare organisations against. And I guess the last thing would be having the ability to compare skills and competencies. It's really easy for an organisation to say we are highly skilled and we're highly competent and present something that is purely academic, or driven by qualifications. But many people can have skills and competencies that cannot be assessed through examination. And so we would suggest that organisations look wider, just to see, is this organisation involved in the community? Are they undertaking research? Are they delivering thought leadership? Are they generating tooling? Are there other richer ways to measure the skills and competencies? And of course, again, the last point is all of those things I've described just now are going to be hugely relevant if you're trying to deliver an assurance activity that's simulating a sophisticated threat actor. If actually all you're wanting to try and do is something that's quick and compliance-led, actually maybe those kind of things will be less relevant.
Right,
maybe some basic level proficiency measured by things like CRT or CCT will be enough.
Right. So at the end of the day, the organisation, the buyer, has to know what its drivers are for engaging the buyer.
I think that's the biggest challenge. And when CREST engages with the buying community when things have gone wrong, typically it's because there was a disconnect in what the buyer thought they were looking for and ultimately what they communicated to the service provider. If the buyer goes into the engagement with a clearly understood set of goals and objectives, it's going to lead to a much better outcome in the assessment.
Well, I think ultimately everyone has to recognize the fact that, there's no 100% security, right? So no matter how much security assurance that you're looking for from your vendors or your, suppliers, there's no such thing as 100% security. And
no, that's right. I think it's going to be risk-based. I think it's going to be budget constrained. And we also recognize that things will evolve quickly. If we wind the clock back 12 months ago, many organizations had fairly robust security assurance programs. Log4j happened, and suddenly everything needed to stop, and they had to go off and do some firefighting. So you're right, there is no such thing as 100%. Instead of focusing on 100% or the best, we would absolutely advocate that people start focusing on good. Once they've got good, then get focused on better, and once they've got focused, then start looking at this. Often people want to shoot straight for red teaming when they're actually not doing basic vulnerability analysis or basic pen testing, or they're not doing something that's more continuous in nature. If you're not doing those kind of things, don't go off and have a threat-led red teaming.
You also have a framework called the Penetration Maturity Assessment Framework, don't you?
We do.
Yeah, but I think that's a conversation for another day.
That's a very complex framework that was built a number of years ago. But happy to talk about it on another occasion.
All right. So thank you very much, Rowland. Thank you.
No problem. Lovely to speak to you.
Thank you.
Cheers.